In 1908, a young reporter sat across from the richest man in the world and asked him a question that would take 20 years, 500 interviews, and the lives of the most powerful men in America to fully answer. The question was simple. Why do some people end up in the 1% while everyone else, working just as hard, stays exactly where they started? Andrew Carnegie didn't answer right away. He just looked at the young man, Napoleon Hill, and smiled, like he already knew something Hill didn't. Then he gave him an assignment that sounded almost insane. Go interview 500 of the wealthiest, most successful men in the country. Find the pattern, the one thing they all have in common. No salary, no guarantee, just the truth, if Hill was patient enough to find it. 20 years later, he found it. And it wasn't what anyone expected. Not hard work, not talent, not even money itself. Something most people never hear, and even fewer ever apply. That's what we're talking about today. Here's something most people don't know about that conversation between Hill and Carnegie. Carnegie never actually told him the secret. Not directly. Not in a single sentence Hill could write down and repeat. If the secret to wealth had been that simple, a phrase, a quote, a single piece of advice, Carnegie would have told every employee he ever had, and they would have all become millionaires. That's not what happened. Instead, Carnegie told Hill something stranger. He said the secret was hidden in plain sight inside the stories of successful men themselves, scattered, fragmented, never assembled into a single coherent system. Every wealthy man Carnegie knew had a piece of it. None of them had the whole picture. They had each stumbled onto fragments of a principle so consistent, so reliable, that it explained the difference between the men who built empires and the men who worked themselves into early graves chasing someone else's dream. Carnegie's challenge to Hill wasn't go find the secret. It was go find the pattern these men don't even know they're following. And that distinction matters more than it sounds like it should. Because here's what almost nobody talks about when they discuss the 1%. Most of the people in that top tier didn't get there by discovering some hidden trick the rest of us don't have access to. They got there because, somewhere along the way, often without realizing it, they started operating according to a set of principles that the other 99% never even identified, let alone practiced consistently. Not secret information, unrecognized information. There's a difference. A secret is something hidden from you on purpose. Unrecognized information is something sitting right in front of you that you've been trained not to see. Hill spent 20 years doing something nobody else had done before him. He didn't just talk to wealthy men. He cross-referenced their stories. He found where Edison's experience overlapped with Ford's, where Carnegie's thinking matched the thinking of men in completely different industries who had never met each other. And what emerged wasn't motivational fluff. It was a blueprint, a set of laws that operated with the same precision as the laws of physics, except these governed the accumulation of wealth and the construction of an extraordinary life. Here's what should unsettle you a little. If these principles are real, if they actually govern who ends up at the top and who stays exactly where they started, then the gap between you and the 1% was never about resources. It was about information you were never given. Not because someone hid it from you maliciously, but because the systems most of us grow up inside, school, work, even well-meaning family advice, were never designed to teach it. Think about your own education for a moment. Think about every class you sat through, every piece of career advice you absorbed growing up. How much of it was about getting a stable job, working hard, being responsible, saving what you could? And how much of it, be honest, actually addressed the internal architecture of how wealth is actually built? Almost none. For almost everyone. Which means the 99% aren't failing because they're lazy or incapable. They're operating, generation after generation, on a script that was never designed to produce wealth in the first place. The 1% broke from that script. Sometimes consciously, sometimes by accident. But they broke from it. And the principles Hill uncovered explain exactly how. There's one in particular, the very first one Hill identified, the one every single wealthy man in his research shared without exception, that most people hear about and completely misunderstand. Because on the surface, it sounds almost too simple to matter. Hill called it definiteness of purpose. And I want to pause here, because the moment most people hear that phrase, something happens in their mind that actually works against them. They nod. They think, yeah, I have goals. They mentally check the box and move on, assuming they already understand and already practice this principle. That assumption is exactly why so few people ever join the 1%. Because what Hill discovered wasn't that wealthy people have goals. Almost everyone has goals. Goals are cheap. Goals are the New Year's resolutions written on January 1st and abandoned by February. Goals are the vague, I want to be successful someday, that floats in the back of most people's minds without ever taking concrete shape. What Hill found in every single one of his 500 interviews was something far more specific, far more demanding. These men didn't have goals. They had a singular, burning, almost obsessive clarity about exactly what they were building, and they had organized every available resource, every waking hour, every ounce of their mental energy around that one specific outcome. Carnegie didn't want to do well and steal. He had decided, with total clarity, that he was going to dominate the steel industry in America. Not someday, not eventually. He could tell you the specific outcome he was working toward before he had the resources to achieve it. Ford didn't want to build cars. He had a definite, almost irrational conviction that he would put an automobile within reach of every working American family. At a time when cars were luxury items for the wealthy, and everyone around him said it was impossible. Here's what made the difference. It wasn't the size of the vision. It was the definiteness. Most people who fail to build wealth aren't failing because they don't want enough. They're failing because what they want is foggy, undefined, a general direction instead of a specific destination. Think about your own life for a moment. If I asked you right now, not what you want eventually, not your vague hope for more, but the exact number, the exact outcome, the exact date by which you intend to have it, could you answer immediately? With certainty? Without hesitation? Most people can't. And Hill's research suggests that inability, that fog around your own desire, isn't a small detail. It's the entire reason the gap exists between where you are and where the 1% live. Because here's the mechanism behind why definiteness works, and it's not mystical. It's almost mechanical. A vague desire produces vague action. When you don't know exactly what you're building toward, your mind can't filter opportunities effectively. You can't recognize the right resource when it appears because you don't know precisely what you're looking for. You hesitate at decision points because nothing is clear enough to decide against. But a definite purpose changes the entire architecture of how your mind operates. Suddenly, you can say no to things that don't serve the specific outcome. Suddenly, you recognize opportunities that would have been invisible to you a month earlier, not because they're new, but because your mind finally knows what it's scanning for. Suddenly, decisions that used to take weeks of deliberation become instant, because you're measuring every choice against one clear standard instead of a fog of competing possibilities. He'll watch this happen over and over. Men who had been stuck for years, suddenly moving with startling speed the moment they replaced a vague ambition with a specific, written, deadline-driven purpose. It wasn't that opportunity suddenly appeared in their lives. It was that opportunity had always been there, and for the first time, they were equipped to recognize it. This is the first thing separating the 1% from everyone else. Not better luck, not more resources, a level of clarity about their own desire that most people never reach, because nobody ever taught them that clarity itself was the prerequisite for everything else. But clarity alone wasn't enough, because Hill discovered something else in his research. Something almost every one of those 500 men experienced at some point. A moment where the people around them tried, with good intentions, to talk them out of exactly the thing that would eventually make them wealthy. Here's something Hill documented that rarely gets talked about when people discuss his work. Almost every single wealthy man he interviewed had a story, sometimes more than one, about a moment when the people closest to them tried to talk them out of the decision that eventually made them rich. Not enemies, not strangers, the people who loved them most. Parents who wanted stability for their children, spouses who were terrified of risk, friends who genuinely believed they were watching someone make a catastrophic mistake, mentors who had built their own careers on caution and couldn't understand why anyone would walk away from something secure. Hill called this phenomenon something specific. He noted that the average person, surrounded by well-meaning people who themselves never escaped average circumstances, will almost always receive advice that quietly pulls them back toward average outcomes. Not out of malice, out of fear disguised as love. Think about how that actually works in a life. Someone close to you sees you taking a risk, leaving a stable job, investing in something uncertain, pursuing a path nobody in your family has walked before, and what they feel is genuine fear for your well-being. They've never seen anyone close to them succeed at the thing you're attempting, so their entire frame of reference tells them it probably won't work. And so they say the things people say. Be realistic. Don't get your hopes up. Have you thought about what happens if this fails? Maybe you should have a backup plan. Every sentence sounds reasonable. Every sentence is also, according to Hill's research, one of the most consistent forces keeping people out of the 1%. Because here's what almost nobody says out loud. The 1% didn't get there by listening to everyone who loved them. They got there by learning to distinguish between advice that came from genuine wisdom and advice that came from someone else's fear projected onto their life. Ford's own family doubted him. Edison was told by people who cared about him that he was wasting his life on an idea that didn't work. After thousands of failed attempts, when from the outside, it genuinely looked like he was failing. Carnegie left a stable, respectable position to pursue something uncertain, against the advice of people who thought he was making a serious mistake. Every one of them had to develop something Hill considered essential to escaping average outcomes. The ability to hold their own conviction even when people they trusted disagreed with it. Not stubbornness, not arrogance, something more specific than that. A trained capacity to evaluate advice based on whether the person giving it had actually achieved what you're trying to achieve, rather than simply trusting advice because it came from someone who loved you. This is genuinely uncomfortable to hear, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise. Because most of us were raised to believe that the people who love us always have our best interests at heart, and that's often true emotionally. But Hill's research points to something harder to accept. Loving you and understanding the specific path you're walking are not the same thing. Someone can love you completely and still, without realizing it, be the exact voice that keeps you in the 99%. This isn't permission to ignore everyone in your life or treat caution as weakness. Hill wasn't reckless, and neither were the men he studied. But there's a difference between thoughtful counsel and fear disguised as wisdom, and learning to tell them apart might be one of the most valuable skills you ever develop. Now, I want to ask you to do something. If what I just described has happened in your life, if you felt that pull, that well-meaning resistance from people around you when you tried to move towards something bigger, I want you to write the word wealth in the comments right now. Not as a ritual, as a declaration. Because the people who write that word today, who are willing to name what they're building even with the discomfort of people around them who might not fully understand it yet, those are the people who, a year from now, look back and recognize this as the moment they stopped asking for permission. Write it, and let's keep going. Because there's a second principle Hill uncovered, one that explains not just how the 1% think, but how they actually move through obstacles that stop everyone else cold. There's a pattern Hill noticed that took him years to fully articulate, because at first, it didn't look like a pattern at all. It looked like luck. Every wealthy man he interviewed had a moment, sometimes several, where everything fell apart, where the business failed, the investment collapsed, the plan that was supposed to work didn't. From the outside, watching these moments in isolation, you'd assume you were looking at the end of someone's story. But Hill wasn't watching in isolation. He was watching the entire arc. And what he found was this. Every single failure that looked catastrophic in the moment turned out, in hindsight, to be the exact event that redirected these men toward the opportunity that actually made them wealthy. Not most of the time. Every time. Henry Ford's first company failed completely. Investors lost confidence. The board pushed him out of his own venture. By every conventional measure, it was a disaster, the kind of failure that ends most people's ambitions permanently. But that failure taught Ford something his success never could have. It showed him exactly what not to do, who not to partner with, and what kind of control he needed to maintain over his own vision. The Ford Motor Company that eventually changed American manufacturing forever was built directly on the lessons extracted from that collapse. Hill called this principle the seed of equivalent benefit, and he wasn't being poetic. He meant it almost mathematically. He claimed, based on hundreds of documented cases, that every significant setback carries within it the exact information needed to produce an equivalent or greater advantage, if the person experiencing it is willing to look for it instead of collapsing under it. Here's why this matters more than it might sound like it does. The 99% experience failure and interpret it as a verdict, a signal to stop, confirmation of every doubt they secretly carried about whether they belonged in the first place. The 1% experience the exact same failure, often something genuinely devastating, not a minor inconvenience, and interpret it as data, information, a redirection rather than a conclusion. That's not positive thinking in the shallow sense people usually mean when they use that phrase. It's a trained mental discipline, a specific, deliberate practice of refusing to let the meaning of an event be dictated entirely by how painful it feels in the moment it's happening. Hill watched men do this in circumstances that would have broken almost anyone. Total financial collapse, public humiliation, years of work destroyed in a matter of weeks. And the men who eventually reached the top 1% weren't the ones who avoided these moments. They were the ones who had trained themselves, deliberately, to extract the lesson before the wound had even finished closing. This is genuinely difficult to do. I'm not going to pretend it's simple. When something falls apart, when the plan you built your hope around collapses, every instinct in your body wants to interpret that as proof that you were wrong to try in the first place. That instinct is ancient. It's protective. It's trying to keep you from risking further pain. But Hill's research suggests that instinct, while understandable, is precisely what keeps people in the 99%. Because the question that determines which group you end up in isn't whether you'll experience setbacks. Everyone does. Every single person in the 1% experienced devastating failure at some point. Often more than once, often worse than what stopped the people around them permanently. The question is what you do in the weeks that follow. Whether you let the failure write the final chapter of that particular story, or whether you treat it, as Hill's research suggests you should, as raw material. Information you didn't have before. A more precise map of what actually works, purchased at the cost of finding out what doesn't. There's a phrase Hill used that I think about often. He said adversity is nature's way of forcing you to discover strength you didn't know you had access to. Not creating the strength. Forcing the discovery of strength that was always there, dormant, waiting for circumstances extreme enough to demand it. Think about your own life for a moment. Think about the hardest thing you've ever moved through. Didn't you discover something in yourself during that period that you didn't know existed before it happened? That's not coincidence. According to Hill's research, that's the mechanism by which every person who eventually reaches extraordinary outcomes gets equipped for what comes next. The setback isn't separate from the success. It's the training ground for it. But there's something else Hill found buried inside this pattern. Something about exactly how these men responded in the specific hours and days right after the collapse. A detail most people overlook entirely because it happens in private where nobody's watching. This is the part of Hill's research that almost never makes it into the popular retellings of his work. Because the public version of these stories is always clean, tidy. The failure happens, and then, almost immediately, in the way it gets told later, the comeback begins. That's not what actually happened. Hill, in his private notes and the longer interviews that didn't make it into the polished final version of his work, documented something messier, something more human. In the days immediately following every major failure he studied, there was almost always a period of genuine collapse. Not strategic repositioning, not immediate pivoting into action, actual, unguarded despair. These men doubted themselves completely in those private hours. Some of them, by their own later admission, considered giving up entirely. Some questioned not just the specific venture that had failed, but their fundamental capability, whether they had ever really had what it took, or whether the whole pursuit had been a kind of self-delusion from the start. Hill found this detail important enough to document specifically because it contradicts the version of success most people carry in their heads. The version where the people who make it never really doubt themselves, where confidence is constant, where the 1% simply don't experience the kind of paralyzing uncertainty that visits everyone else. That version is false. What actually distinguished these men wasn't the absence of that private collapse. It was what happened on the other side of it. There was, in every single account Hill documented, a specific moment, sometimes hours after the worst of the despair, sometimes days, where something shifted. Not because the external circumstances had changed. The business was still failed. The money was still gone. The public humiliation, if there had been one, hadn't disappeared. What changed was internal. A decision, made quietly, usually alone, with no audience and no fanfare. The decision to stand back up before they had any evidence that standing back up would work. This is the part Hill considered almost sacred in his research. And it's the part most retellings of his work skip entirely because it doesn't fit neatly into a motivational quote. These men didn't recover because they found a reason to be confident again. They recovered because, in the depth of genuine uncertainty, with no guarantee of success, and every reasonable indication that they might be wrong to continue, they decided anyway. That decision, made without evidence, made in the dark, made when literally nothing in their external circumstances justified it, is what Hill eventually concluded was the single most consistent trait across every member of the 1% he studied. Not talent, not even persistence in the way people usually use that word, which implies a kind of grinding continuation. This was something quieter and, in some ways, more remarkable. The willingness to choose to believe again, deliberately, before belief had been earned back by circumstances. Think about what that actually requires. It's relatively easy to feel confident when things are going well. It's relatively easy to maintain belief in yourself when the evidence around you confirms that belief. That's not the skill Hill identified, because that's not actually a skill. That's just circumstance making belief easy. The thing that separates the 1% is the capacity to generate that same quality of conviction when circumstances are actively arguing against it. When the failed business is still sitting there, unsold. When the bank account reflects the collapse, not the comeback. When the people who doubted you feel, for the moment, completely vindicated. In that exact moment, with nothing external to support it, choosing to stand up anyway. Hill called this quality, in one of his later writings, the difference between people who fail permanently and people who experience temporary defeat. He was precise about that distinction. Permanent failure, he argued, almost never happens because of the original setback itself. It happens because the person decides, in the aftermath, that the setback was final. And the 1%, every single one of them, without exception, according to Hill's research, refused to let any single moment make that determination for them. Not because they were certain they would succeed, but because they had decided, somewhere along the way, that the alternative, staying down, accepting the collapse as the end of the story, was simply not available to them as an option. That's not confidence. That's something closer to identity. A decision about who you are that doesn't depend on what just happened to you. And once you understand that distinction, something else Hill discovered starts to make a lot more sense. Something about how these men actually used their minds differently on a daily basis, in ways that had nothing to do with crisis at all. Here's something Hill discovered that surprised even him, 20 years into his research. The most significant difference between the 1% and everyone else wasn't visible in the dramatic moments. Not in the crisis, not in the comeback, not in the big decisions that make for good stories. It was visible in the ordinary Tuesday afternoons, in what these men did with their minds when nothing important was happening at all. Hill noticed it almost by accident, because he wasn't initially looking for it. He was asking about strategy, about decisions, about the visible architecture of how these men built what they built. But the more time he spent around them, not interviewing them formally, just observing how they moved through ordinary days, the more he noticed something underneath all of it. Their minds were different in a way that had nothing to do with intelligence. They were quieter, not in the sense of being soft-spoken, though some of them were. Quieter in a deeper sense, less cluttered, less occupied by the constant low-grade noise of anxiety, comparison, and scattered half-formed worry that Hill observed in almost everyone he met who hadn't achieved anything close to what these men had built. He started paying closer attention to this, and what he found changed the direction of his research. These men, almost without exception, had developed, sometimes deliberately, sometimes by accident, a specific relationship with their own thoughts that the average person never develops. They didn't let their minds run freely in every direction the way most people do. Think about your own mental experience on an average day, the thoughts that arrive uninvited. Worry about something that probably won't happen. Comparison to someone you saw on a screen for 4 seconds. Replaying a conversation from 3 days ago, refining what you should have said. Low-grade dread about something in the future that hasn't occurred yet and may never occur. Most people experience this as simply what it means to have a mind. Background noise. The cost of being conscious. Hill found that the men who built extraordinary lives experienced something different. Not because their minds were naturally quieter. Several of them admitted to Hill that earlier in their lives, before they understood what they were doing, their minds had been just as chaotic as anyone else's. The difference was that, at some point, they had started treating their own thoughts as something they had authority over. Not suppressing thoughts, not forcing positivity, something more precise than either of those things. They had developed the capacity to notice a thought arriving, evaluate whether it served the direction they had decided to move in, and consciously choose whether to continue thinking it or redirect their attention elsewhere. This sounds simple when you describe it in a sentence. It is not simple in practice. Most people have never tried to do this even once. Most people have never noticed that they have any authority over which thoughts they continue entertaining and which ones they let pass through without engagement. The thought arrives, and the average mind simply follows it, the way a dog follows any scent that crosses its path, regardless of where that scent leads. Hill watched these successful men do something different. A worry would arrive, about money, about a decision, about something genuinely uncertain in their business, and rather than spiraling into it the way most people do, they would, almost mechanically, ask themselves a specific question. Is this thought useful to the outcome I've decided to create? If the answer was no, they redirected. Not through force, through practiced, repeated redirection that had become, over years, almost automatic. This is what Hill eventually concluded was one of the most underrated principles in his entire body of research, because it doesn't photograph well. It doesn't make for a dramatic story. Nobody writes a biography chapter about a man quietly redirecting his own thoughts on an unremarkable afternoon. But Hill became convinced that this quiet, daily, mostly invisible practice was doing more to create the gap between the 1% and everyone else than almost any single decision or strategy he documented. Because here's the compounding effect most people never calculate. If your mind spends an average day running anxious, scattered, comparison-driven thoughts on autopilot, that mental pattern isn't neutral. It's actively consuming resources, attention, emotional energy, the capacity for clear decision-making that would otherwise be available for building the thing you say you want to build. Multiply that by every day for years. The 1% weren't necessarily working more hours than everyone else. In many documented cases, they were working fewer. But the hours they spent thinking were spent differently. Less noise, more direction. And that difference, compounded daily over a decade or two, produces results that look from the outside like genius or luck, when really, it was something far more available than either of those things. It was attention deliberately managed, day after day, in a way almost nobody else was willing to practice. But managing your own attention, it turns out, requires something underneath it. A foundation Hill identified as even more fundamental, something that determines whether this kind of mental discipline is even possible to sustain. Hill eventually arrived at a question that troubled him for longer than almost any other part of his research. If managing your own thoughts was this important, if the quiet, daily redirection of attention was really doing as much work as he suspected, why didn't everyone simply do it? It sounds, on the surface, like a matter of willpower. Decide to think better thoughts. Choose discipline. The kind of advice that sounds reasonable in a sentence and falls apart completely the moment you try to live it. Hill knew that explanation was incomplete because he'd watched intelligent, motivated people try exactly that approach and fail within days. Willpower alone, applied to thought management, burns out fast. Anyone who has tried to simply think positive through force of will already knows this from experience. So Hill kept digging, and what he found underneath the discipline surprised him. The men who successfully managed their own minds over decades, not just for a motivated week or two, weren't doing it through willpower at all. They were doing it because they had something underneath the discipline that made the discipline almost unnecessary. A reason, not a goal. Not even the definiteness of purpose Hill had already identified, though that was related. Something deeper than that. A reason connected to something or someone that mattered to them more than their own comfort. Hill found, again and again, that the men who sustained extraordinary discipline over the long term were rarely doing it purely for themselves. There was almost always someone else woven into the reason. A family they were determined to lift out of circumstances they themselves had escaped. A parent they wanted to prove something to, sometimes even after that parent had passed away. Children whose entire future trajectory would be shaped by what these men built. A version of themselves from years earlier, younger, struggling, afraid, that they were, in some private way, still trying to rescue. This detail mattered more than Hill initially gave it credit for, because pure self-interest, he discovered, has a ceiling. It motivates you on the good days. It gets you through moderate difficulty. But pure self-interest tends to collapse exactly at the moment you need motivation most, in the depth of genuine crisis, when continuing to push forward offers no clear personal benefit and significant personal cost. But a reason connected to something beyond yourself operates differently. It doesn't ask whether you feel like continuing. It simply continues, because the alternative, quitting, when something or someone beyond your own comfort depends on you not quitting, isn't actually available as an option in the way pure self-interested ambition can quietly become negotiable. Hill watched this distinction play out repeatedly. Men who were building wealth purely for personal gain often stalled at the first serious obstacle, finding reasons to scale back their ambition to something more comfortable. Men who were building wealth connected to something larger than themselves, even when the external circumstances were identical, pushed through obstacles that should have stopped them. This is uncomfortable to sit with, because it suggests something most people don't want to hear. If your reason for wanting wealth is vague, if it's something like, I want to be comfortable, or I want to be successful, without a deeper connection to something that matters beyond your own experience, Hill's research suggests you may be working with a foundation too thin to support the discipline required to actually reach the 1%. Not because comfort isn't a valid desire. It is. But comfort, as a motivating force, tends to evaporate exactly when things get uncomfortable, which is precisely when you need it most. I want you to consider something for a moment. What's underneath your own desire for the life you're building toward? Not the surface answer. Not financial freedom or success, which are real but somewhat thin as foundations. Go a layer deeper. Who is it actually for? What does it actually mean beneath the financial number to the people and the parts of your own story that are woven into why you want it? He'll believe that question, answered honestly, not performed for an audience, was one of the most predictive indicators of whether someone would eventually reach the 1% or whether they would, at some point, quietly negotiate their way back down to something more comfortable and far more average. Because the climb, by every account Hill documented, gets genuinely difficult at some point. Not metaphorically difficult, actually difficult, in ways that test whether your reason for continuing can survive contact with real adversity. A thin reason breaks under that pressure. A deep one doesn't. And once Hill understood this, he started to see something else. A final piece of the pattern that explained not just how these men got to the top, but how they managed to stay there, something almost none of them talked about publicly, because it required admitting something most successful people are reluctant to say out loud. Here's what Hill eventually uncovered, late in his research, that most of the men he interviewed were reluctant to discuss directly. None of them did it alone. This might sound obvious when you say it out loud. Of course, successful people have employees, partners, investors. But that's not what Hill was pointing to, and it's not what made this discovery uncomfortable for the men involved. What Hill found was something more specific. Every single man he studied who reached extraordinary wealth had, at some critical juncture, relied on the direct intellectual and emotional support of at least one other person whose belief in the outcome was as strong as their own. Not an employee following instructions. A genuine ally. Someone whose mind, combined with theirs, produced thinking that neither of them could have generated in isolation. Carnegie had this relationship with several of the men who eventually became his most trusted partners. Ford had it with a small circle of engineers and thinkers who believed in his vision before there was any evidence it would work. Edison, despite his reputation as a solitary genius working alone in a laboratory, relied heavily on a team of collaborators whose combined thinking produced results none of them could have reached independently. Hill called this principle the mastermind, and he considered it, by the end of his research, possibly the single most underrated factor in the entire body of work he had spent 2 decades assembling. Here's why it's uncomfortable for successful people to admit. There's a cultural mythology around the self-made man, the lone genius, the person who built an empire through sheer individual will, asking nothing from anyone, succeeding entirely through personal exceptionalism. That mythology is almost entirely false, according to Hill's actual documented findings. Every man in his research who reached the 1% had, at some point, needed someone else. Not for money, necessarily. For something harder to quantify. For belief, at a moment when their own belief was running thin. For a perspective their own mind couldn't generate because it was too close to the problem. For the specific, irreplaceable energy that gets created when two people who are both fully committed to the same outcome combine their thinking. Hill documented case after case where the breakthrough moment in someone's career wasn't a solitary insight. It was a conversation. Two minds, aligned around a shared purpose, generating an idea or a solution that neither person would have reached alone. This matters enormously for anyone trying to understand why some people join the 1% and others don't, because it points to something most people overlook entirely when they think about building wealth. They think about it as an individual project, personal discipline, personal effort, personal sacrifice. And while all of that matters, Hill's research suggests it's incomplete without something else. The deliberate cultivation of at least one relationship where two people are genuinely, fully aligned around the same outcome, sharing not just information, but actual belief. This is rarer than it sounds. Most relationships, even close ones, don't operate this way. Most people surround themselves with others who are kind, supportive in a general sense, but not actually aligned around a specific, ambitious outcome with the kind of intensity Hill was describing. A spouse who loves you but doesn't fully understand or believe in the specific direction you're building toward isn't the same as a mastermind relationship. A friend who's generally encouraging isn't the same either. Hill was describing something more specific and, frankly, more rare. A relationship where the other person's belief in your outcome is genuine enough, strong enough, that it can actually stabilize you during the moments your own belief wavers. And here's the part that should make you think carefully about your own life. If you don't currently have at least one relationship like that, someone whose belief in what you're building is real, informed, and strong, Hill's research suggests that absence might be doing more to hold you back than almost any external circumstance you could name. Not because you can't succeed without it, but because the climb gets exponentially harder when you're trying to generate every ounce of belief entirely from your own internal resources, with no outside reinforcement, during the exact periods when your own belief is running low. This raises an uncomfortable question, not about strategy, about the actual composition of the people closest to you. Are they reflecting back belief in the direction you've chosen? Or are they, even with good intentions, reflecting back the same uncertainty you're already fighting internally? Hill's research suggests this single factor, who you've allowed into the inner circle of your thinking, might be doing more to determine your trajectory than almost any other variable in this entire body of work. But there's a final layer to all of this. Something that ties every principle we've covered together into a single coherent explanation for why the 1% exist at all, and why most people, even after hearing everything we've discussed, still won't join them. Here's the question Hill eventually had to confront directly, because his research demanded an answer. If these principles are real, if they're consistent, documented, repeatable across hundreds of cases spanning different industries and different decades, why doesn't everyone simply apply them? Why does the 1% remain the 1% generation after generation, even after Hill published his findings in a book that has sold tens of millions of copies? The answer he arrived at was harder to hear than anything else in his research. It wasn't that people didn't have access to the information. By the time Hill finished his work, the information was available to anyone willing to read it. It was that most people, when they encountered these principles, didn't actually believe the principles applied to them specifically. This is subtle, and it's worth sitting with for a moment. Most people who read about definiteness of purpose, about persistence through failure, about the mastermind principle, intellectually agree with all of it. They nod along. They might even feel temporarily inspired. But underneath that intellectual agreement, there's a quieter, more powerful belief running in the background. A belief that says, essentially, this works for people like that, not for someone like me. Hill encountered this constantly, and it troubled him because he couldn't find a way around it through information alone. You could hand someone the complete blueprint, documented across 500 case studies, and it wouldn't matter if some part of them had already decided, often years before they ever encountered Hill's work, that extraordinary outcomes were reserved for other kinds of people. This belief rarely announces itself directly. Nobody walks around consciously thinking, I don't deserve wealth, or people like me don't become the 1%. It's quieter than that. It shows up as a kind of low-grade resignation, a tendency to abandon ambitious plans just before they require real risk, a pattern of self-sabotage that looks, from the outside, like bad luck or poor timing, but that Hill came to believe was something else entirely. It was the nervous system protecting an old identity. Here's what Hill understood that most people miss completely. The mind doesn't just pursue what you consciously want. It also, simultaneously, works to keep you consistent with who you've always believed yourself to be. If somewhere in your history, through family circumstances, through early experiences, through years of being told directly or indirectly what was realistic for someone like you, you absorbed an identity that didn't include extraordinary wealth, then a strange thing happens whenever you get close to violating that identity. Something inside you starts to sabotage the progress. Not consciously, not because you actually want to fail, but because some deeper part of your mind is more committed to staying consistent with your established identity than it is committed to your stated goals. This explains something that confused Hill for years before he understood it. Why intelligent, capable people who clearly understood the principles would still find ways to undermine their own progress at the exact moment things started working. It wasn't incompetence. It was an old identity, quietly defending its territory. The 1%, according to Hill's deeper research, weren't simply people who learned better strategies. They were people who, at some point, had done the much harder work of actually updating their identity, of genuinely coming to believe, at a level deeper than intellectual agreement, that extraordinary outcomes were available to someone like them. This is why information alone has never been sufficient. You can know every principle Hill documented and still remain in the 99%, because the principles only work once you've done the deeper work of believing they apply to you specifically. And that work is uncomfortable in a way that reading a book or watching a video never is, because it requires confronting the actual source of your own self-doubt, not the surface version, the polite, socially acceptable, "I'm just being realistic," but the deeper version underneath it, the actual moment or moments where you first absorbed the belief that extraordinary outcomes weren't meant for you. Most people never do this work, which is exactly why the 1% remains the 1%. Not because the principles are secret, because the willingness to update your own identity is rare. But for the people who do this work, who actually confront and rebuild the identity underneath their ambition, something shifts that goes beyond strategy entirely. And what happens next, according to everything Hill documented, isn't gradual. It's sudden, in a way that surprised even the men who experienced it. There's a pattern Hill documented that contradicts almost everything people assume about how success actually arrives. We tend to imagine it as a slow, linear climb. Work a little harder each year. Improve incrementally. Eventually, after enough accumulated effort, arrive somewhere significant. That's not what Hill found in the actual stories of the men he studied. What he found instead was something closer to a threshold. A long period, sometimes years, of effort that produced results disproportionately small compared to the work being invested. Followed, almost without warning, by a compression of outcomes that seemed to arrive all at once. Hill described it almost like pressure building against a dam. From the outside, during the years before the breakthrough, nothing appears to be happening. The effort looks wasted. The results look almost embarrassingly small compared to what's being poured in. And then, at some point that's almost impossible to predict in advance, something gives way. Not because anything dramatic changed in that specific month, but because every principle being practiced, the definiteness of purpose, the persistence through failure, the disciplined management of thought, the deep reason underneath the ambition, the mastermind relationships providing belief during the low periods, the slow, invisible work of rebuilding an identity that could actually hold extraordinary outcomes. All of it had been compounding quietly, beneath the surface, for longer than anyone watching could see. The breakthrough looks sudden from the outside. It almost never is. Hill called this the point where accumulated effort crosses into momentum, and he noted something important about it. The years immediately preceding this threshold are almost always the hardest, most discouraging years in the entire journey. Not because things are getting worse, because the gap between effort and visible results is at its widest exactly before that gap finally collapses. This explains something that destroys more potential than almost anything else Hill documented. The vast majority of people who fail to reach the 1% don't fail because the principles don't work for them. They fail because they stop applying the principles in the exact season where the principles were about to work. They quit during the years of disproportionate effort and minimal visible return, never finding out that they were, in many documented cases, remarkably close to the threshold where everything would have started compounding visibly. This is, by Hill's own account, one of the most tragic patterns in his entire research. Not failure caused by lack of ability. Failure caused by understandable, human exhaustion, arriving at exactly the wrong moment, just before the years of invisible effort would have become visible. I want you to think about this carefully, because it has direct implications for wherever you currently are in your own journey. If you've been applying real effort towards something for a meaningful period of time, and the results so far feel disproportionately small compared to what you're investing, Hill's research suggests something important. That gap isn't necessarily evidence that the path isn't working. It might be the exact signature of the period right before the threshold. This isn't comfortable reassurance designed to keep you going regardless of circumstances. Hill wasn't interested in blind optimism, and neither am I. There's a difference between persisting toward a genuinely viable direction and refusing to acknowledge when something needs to change. But here's what's worth sitting with. Almost every person Hill studied who eventually reached the 1% had, at some point in their journey, a season that looked from the outside exactly like failure. Years where the effort invested vastly outweighed the visible return. Periods where, if they had quit, and many people in identical circumstances did quit, no one would have blamed them. It would have looked like the reasonable decision. The men who didn't quit during that season weren't operating on certainty. They were operating on the accumulated weight of every principle we've discussed combined together. The definiteness of purpose that wouldn't let them settle for something vaguer. The disciplined relationship with their own thoughts that prevented despair from making the final decision. The deeper reason underneath the ambition that made quitting feel like betraying something larger than personal comfort. The mastermind relationship that provided belief during the exact period their own belief was running thin. All of it, compounding together, quietly, until the threshold finally arrived. And once it does, according to every account Hill documented, something happens that's almost difficult to describe to someone who hasn't experienced it. The same effort that used to produce barely visible results suddenly starts producing outcomes that seem disproportionate in the opposite direction. Not because the effort changed, because everything beneath the surface had finally finished compounding. There's one final piece of Hill's research that I've saved until now, because it only makes sense after everything we've already covered. Late in his life, long after Think and Grow Rich had already made him known around the world, Hill was asked a question by a younger writer studying his work. The question was simple. If you had to compress everything you learned from 500 interviews into a single sentence, what would it be? Hill thought about it for a long time before answering. And what he eventually said wasn't about strategy or persistence or even definiteness of purpose, though all of those were real and important. He said the defining quality of every person who reached the 1% was that, at some point, they had stopped waiting for permission. Not permission from institutions. Not permission from credentials or qualifications. Permission from themselves. He'll explain what he meant by this, and it reframed everything else in his research. Every man he had studied, at some specific point in their journey, had been carrying around an unconscious assumption that someone else needed to validate their ambition before it was allowed to be real. A parent's approval, a mentor's blessing, some external authority confirming that yes, this dream is legitimate, you're allowed to pursue it seriously. And every single one of them, without exception, had eventually reached a moment where they simply stopped waiting for that validation to arrive. Not because they received it, because they decided, internally, that they no longer required it. This is subtler than it might initially sound, and it's worth sitting with carefully. Most people, Hill observed, spend years in a kind of suspended state, working towards something, but holding back some percentage of their full commitment, because some part of them is still waiting for evidence, for permission, for someone qualified to tell them they're allowed to take this seriously. The 1% didn't wait for that. They gave themselves permission first, often long before there was any external evidence justifying that permission. They acted as if the outcome was already legitimate, already real, already worth their complete commitment, before anyone else agreed with that assessment. This is uncomfortable because it removes the most common excuse people use to explain why they haven't started yet. I'm waiting for the right time. I'm waiting until I have more resources. I'm waiting until someone with more experience tells me I'm ready. Hill's research suggests that wait, for almost everyone who experiences it, never actually ends in the way people expect. The right time doesn't arrive and announce itself. The resources don't simply accumulate to a point that feels sufficient. The permission, if you're waiting for someone else to grant it, frequently never comes, not because you're not ready, but because nobody is actually positioned to grant that kind of permission to another person in the first place. The 1% understood something that almost nobody tells you directly, possibly because it's not a comfortable thing to say to someone who's struggling. You were always allowed. Not because you've proven yourself sufficiently, not because you've accumulated the right credentials or convinced the right people. You were always allowed. In the same way, every person Hill studied was always allowed, long before they accepted that permission for themselves. The gap between where you are now and the 1% was never actually about ability, or luck, or circumstance, in the way most people assume. It was about the moment. And it is always a specific moment, even if it doesn't feel dramatic when it happens, when you stop waiting for someone else to confirm that your ambition is legitimate, and decide, quietly, on your own, that it already is. Everything else we've discussed, the definiteness of purpose, the relationship with failure, the disciplined management of thought, the deeper reason underneath the ambition, the mastermind relationships, the long season before the threshold, all of it becomes available to you the moment you stop waiting for permission you were never going to receive from anyone but yourself. This is, according to Hill, the actual secret behind everything else. Not a technique, a decision, one that's available to you in this exact moment, regardless of what your circumstances currently look like, regardless of who has or hasn't yet believed in what you're building. If you've stayed with me until this point in the video, it's because you're committed to creating a life of abundance and success. That's why I invite you to subscribe to the channel. Every video here is designed to help you develop the mindset that attracts wealth, prosperity, and new opportunities every single day. There's something Hill noticed about the men he interviewed after they had crossed that threshold, after the permission had been granted internally, after the years of disproportionate effort had finally compounded into something visible. It wasn't what you'd expect. You'd assume, reasonably, that arriving in the 1% would feel like relief. Like finally exhaling after years of holding your breath. Like the anxious striving simply stops, replaced by the calm satisfaction of having made it. That's not what Hill documented. What he found instead was something more interesting and frankly more useful for understanding what this entire journey actually is. The men who reached extraordinary wealth almost universally described a strange realization once they arrived. The destination they had been working toward for years didn't feel like an ending. It felt like a different starting point. Carnegie, decades into his success, was still working with the same intensity he'd had as a young man trying to prove himself. Ford, long after he'd already changed the entire automobile industry, was still obsessing over the next improvement, the next problem to solve. These weren't men who reached a finish line and stopped. Hill initially found this confusing. If the entire pursuit was about reaching a specific outcome, a number, a level of success, a position in the 1%, why didn't arriving there produce the satisfaction everyone assumes it will? The answer he eventually arrived at reshapes how you should think about everything we've covered in this video. The wealth itself was never actually the point. It was the byproduct. What these men had actually been building, across years of applying every principle we've discussed, wasn't a bank account. It was a version of themselves capable of operating at a level most people never reach. Definiteness of purpose so clear it eliminated hesitation. A relationship with failure that turned obstacles into information instead of verdicts. A disciplined mind that didn't waste itself on noise. A reason deep enough to survive real adversity. Relationships aligned around genuine belief. And underneath all of it, an identity that had stopped waiting for permission. The wealth arrived as a natural consequence of becoming that version of themselves. But the becoming was the actual achievement. This matters enormously for how you should think about your own journey, because it reframes the entire goal. If you're pursuing wealth purely as an external outcome, a number that, once reached, will finally let you relax, Hill's research suggests you may be missing the actual mechanism by which wealth gets created in the first place. The 1% aren't people who found a clever way to extract money from the world. They're people who became, through years of deliberate internal work, the kind of person money naturally flows toward. The clarity, the discipline, the resilience, the depth of purpose. All of it creates a person who is simply more capable, more magnetic, more equipped to recognize and act on opportunity than someone still operating with a foggy purpose and an undisciplined mind. Which means the work you're doing right now, the internal work, the identity work, the discipline you're building, even if you can't yet see the financial results, isn't separate from the wealth you're trying to create. It is the wealth in its earliest form. Long before it shows up in a bank account, it shows up in how you think, in what you tolerate and what you no longer tolerate, in how you respond to setback, in who you've let into your inner circle, and whether you're still waiting for permission or whether you've already given it to yourself. Hill watched men arrive at extraordinary outcomes and then, instead of stopping, continue applying the exact same principles toward whatever came next. Not because they were addicted to work, in the way that phrase usually implies something unhealthy, because they had discovered something most people never get to discover. The process itself, the discipline, the clarity, the deliberate construction of a mind capable of extraordinary outcomes, had become who they were, not a means to an end, the actual substance of a well-lived life. This is, in many ways, the real secret hiding underneath everything Hill documented. Not a technique for getting rich, though the techniques are real and they work. Something deeper than that. A way of being that produces wealth as a natural side effect of becoming someone capable of holding it. And that way of being is available to you starting today. Not after you've accumulated proof. Not after circumstances improve. Starting the moment you decide to begin operating according to everything we've discussed in this video. The 1% didn't start as the 1%. They started exactly where you might be starting. The only difference was the decision they eventually made, and the version of themselves they were willing to become in order to honor it. I want you to think back to the question that started this video. Carnegie, looking at a young reporter, asking him to go find the one thing the wealthiest men in America had in common. 20 years, 500 interviews, an entire body of research built on a single question that sounds, on the surface, almost too simple to require that kind of effort. But here's what I think Carnegie already understood before Hill ever began. The answer was never going to be a technique, a formula, a single sentence you could read once and apply mechanically, the way you'd follow a recipe. If it had been that simple, Carnegie would have just told him. What Carnegie actually gave Hill, without saying it directly, was the truth that the answer could only be found the long way. Through 500 lives. Through failure and collapse and the quiet, unglamorous decision to stand back up before there was any evidence that standing back up would work. Through years that looked, from the outside, like nothing was happening at all. You've heard all of it now. The clarity that has to exist before anything else can work. The people who will try to stop you, not out of malice, but out of love wearing the disguise of fear. The failures that were never really failures, just information arriving in a form too painful to recognize right away. The quiet, private collapse that happens before every comeback, the part nobody puts in the story. The discipline of a mind that's learned to stop following every thought that arrives uninvited. The reason underneath the ambition, the one that has to be bigger than comfort if it's going to survive real difficulty. The people you let into your thinking, and whether they're reflecting belief back at you or just your own doubt in a different voice. The threshold that arrives only after a season that looks exactly like failure. And underneath everything else, the permission you were always allowed to give yourself, and were simply waiting for someone else to hand you instead. None of this was ever a secret. It was always right here, in your own life, in the moments you've already lived through without realizing what they were teaching you. Carnegie knew that the moment he met Hill, he wasn't sending him out to discover something hidden. He was sending him out to notice what was already in plain sight, and bring back the words for it. You already have the words now. What you do with them is the only part of this story that hasn't been written yet. The 1% were never a different kind of person than you. They were people who, at some point, in some specific and quiet moment that probably didn't feel historic while it was happening, decided to stop waiting. That moment is available to you too. It always was. If this video gave you something worth carrying, follow the channel and share it with 5 people who are ready to hear it. Every video here exists for one reason: to help you become the person who was never actually waiting for permission in the first place.